I work in insurance, a job that is literally about calculating risks based on cold, hard facts. But after a year of back-to-back 60-hour weeks and a mountain of stress, my partner, Sarah, and I just needed to disappear for a while. We found a listing on a whim. It was a secluded coastal gem, tucked away in a quiet corner of the Pacific Northwest. The photo showed a stunning house made of glass and cedar, perched right on a cliffside overlooking the ocean. It looked like the perfect place to decompress. No neighbors, no traffic, just the sound of the waves. The drive up was long, but peaceful. We hit the coast around 4 p.m., watching the fog roll in over the massive trees. When we pulled into the gravel driveway, the house looked even better than the pictures. It was modern, clean, and felt completely isolated from the rest of the world. A man named Elias, who is the owner, met us at the door. He was soft-spoken, maybe in his late 60s, with a thin frame and a very polite smile. He lived in a small mother-in-law suite that occupied the bottom level of the house. He told us he liked to stay on-site to make sure everything was perfect for his guests. At the time, I thought it was just the quirk of a lonely retiree who was overprotective of his property. The first 2 days were exactly what we needed. We spent our mornings drinking coffee on the deck and our afternoons hiking the local trails. The only minor annoyance was how often Elias seemed to be around. It started on the first evening. Sarah and I were opening a bottle of wine on the deck when he suddenly appeared from around the corner. He didn't knock or call out. He was just there, holding a small plastic bag of sugar water. He told us he needed to ensure the hummingbird feeders were full. He lingered for about 10 minutes, talking about the different species of birds in the area. It was a bit awkward, but he seemed harmless enough. On the second day, it happened again. I was sitting on the deck reading a book while Sarah took a nap inside. Elias popped up from the lower level to check the railings. He claimed the salt air caused the wood to swell, and he wanted to make sure everything was tight. He spent a long time looking at the sliding glass door that led into our bedroom. I remember thinking it was strange that he chose that exact moment to do maintenance, but I just ignored it. By the third night, the atmosphere started to feel heavy. It's hard to describe. It wasn't like a haunted house feeling. It was more like the sensation of being watched while you're in your own home. It was a physical pressure in the back of my neck that I couldn't shake off. I woke up around 3:15 a.m. The house was silent, except for the distant sound of the ocean hitting the rocks below. Sarah was sound asleep next to me, breathing deeply. I laid there for a moment, trying to drift back off, when I heard a rhythmic, wet sound. It was coming from directly under our bed, beneath the floorboards. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy, saturated sponge across wood. My heart started a race. I stayed perfectly still, staring at the ceiling. I wanted to reach out and wake Sarah, but I was terrified that if I moved, the sound would stop and I'd never know what it was. The sound moved from one side of the room to the other, right under us. It was heavy. Whatever was making that noise had weight to it. It didn't sound like an animal, but it sounded like something being hauled through a tight space. After about 10 minutes, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, while Sarah was in the kitchen, I went into the en-suite bathroom. I noticed a small, circular piece of black electrical tape on the floor near the base of the toilet. I knelt down and peeled it back. Underneath the tape, there was a hole. It was no wider than a pencil. It was drilled perfectly through the tile and the subfloor. I leaned down and looked through it. All I could see was darkness, but the edges of the hole were clean. It was recent. I felt sick. I didn't tell Sarah because I didn't want to panic her without proof. I told her I was going for a walk. As I walked down the driveway, I noticed Elias's car was gone. This was my chance. Then I circled back to the house and headed for the lower level. There was a shared utility room next to his suite that he said we could use for laundry. The door was unlocked. Then I stepped inside and looked up at the ceiling. My blood turned to ice. The ceiling was covered in hundreds of those little black tape dots. They were mapped out in a grid that corresponded perfectly with the rooms above us. Some were peeled back. Others were fresh. In the corner of the room, behind a water heater, there was a wooden chair. It was positioned directly under a small computer monitor sitting on a cluttered desk. The screen was dark, but next to it sat a stack of Polaroids. I picked them up. My hands were shaking. The first few were of Sarah and me. There was one of us sleeping in bed from the first night, and one of Sarah in the shower. I flipped further down the stack. They were the guests who had stayed there before. There were dozens of them, but in the most recent ones, the people looked different. Their skin was a pale, sickly gray. Their eyes were open, but they looked like glass. They were too still. Suddenly, I heard the gravel crunch outside. Elias was back. I scrambled out of the utility room, keeping low, and ran back up the stairs. I burst through the front door and told Sarah we had to leave right now. I made up a lie about a family emergency. We threw our bags into the car, and I peeled out of the driveway. I saw Elias standing in the shadow of his doorway, just watching us go. I called the police from a gas station 3 towns away. They went to the house, but Elias was long gone. When they searched the crawl space, they found the source of the wet, dragging sound. It wasn't a sponge. They recovered 3 bodies wrapped in heavy plastic. He had been dragging them around under the floorboards to watch the new guests with him. The police never caught him. He used a fake name and paid in cash through a third-party site. I still can't close my eyes without wondering which hole he was looking through while we slept. I think about how close he was to us every single night, and the fact that he's still out there looking for his next rental makes me want to die. This happened back in July of 2019. I was driving solo from Denver to Kansas City, a trip I'd done a dozen times before. If you've ever driven that specific stretch at night before, you know exactly what it feels like. It's just a total void. There's nothing but black asphalt, the hum of your tires, and the occasional red blink of a wind turbine on the horizon. It's easy to zone out, and that's exactly what happened to me. Around 2 a.m., the exhaustion finally hit me like a wall. My eyes were getting heavy, and I found myself drifting over the rumble strip a few times. I knew I couldn't make it the rest of the way without some sleep. I saw a sign for a rest area a few miles ahead and decided to pull in. It wasn't one of those big, well-lit travel plazas with a McDonald's or a gas station. It was just one of those desolate concrete islands with a small bathroom block and a few flickering yellow lights. When I pulled in, the lot was almost completely empty. There was only one other vehicle there, a rusted-out white sedan parked way down at the far end of the lot, almost in the shadows. I didn't think much of it at the time. People sleep at rest stops all the time. I parked my truck under one of the working lights, went inside of the restroom, and splashed some cold water on my face to try and wake up a bit. The air outside was thick and humid. Even at 2 a.m., the heat was sticking to everything. I walked back to my truck, hopped in, and locked the doors. I planned to just lean the seat back and close my eyes for an hour or two. I was just about to settle in when I heard a soft, rhythmic sound. It was someone tapping on my driver's side window. I jumped a little. My heart was racing. I looked up and saw a man standing there. He didn't look like a threat. He just looked exhausted, maybe in his mid-50s, wearing a light windbreaker despite the heat. He didn't look like a creep. He just looked like a guy who was having a really bad night. He gestured for me to roll down the window, just a crack. I hesitated, but I rolled it down about an inch. "Hey, sorry to wake you," he said. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't had a drink of water in days. "My daughter, she's in the car down there. She's had some kind of seizure and my phone is dead. I just need a jump start so I can get her to the hospital in Salina. Please." He pointed toward the white sedan at the end of the lot. I looked over and could see a slumped figure in the passenger seat. My gut was screaming at me to just drive away. Everything about the situation felt heavy. But then I thought about the girl. If she was actually dying, and I just left because I was being paranoid, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. Then I told him I had cables in the back. I got out of the truck, feeling the heavy night air hit me again. As we started walking toward his car, I noticed something small. He wasn't walking beside me. He was staying exactly half a step behind me, just out of my peripheral vision. I slowed down, and he slowed down. I sped up, and he sped up. Then he started talking to me, telling me about his daughter, Sarah. He said she was a straight-A student and had just started piano lessons. He sounded so normal, so proud of her. But as we got closer to the sedan, the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of a dirty car or old food. It was sweet and thick, like rotting fruit left out in the sun. It was overpowering. The man didn't seem to notice. He just kept talking about Sarah's piano recitals. We reached the passenger side of his car, and I leaned over to look through the glass of the girl. The interior of the car was filthy. There were fast food wrappers and old newspapers everywhere. I looked at the girl in the seat, and the air left my lungs. She wasn't having a seizure. She was gray. Her skin looked like wet parchment paper. Her head was tilted back at an angle that no living person could sustain, and her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. Then I saw them. Flies. Even in the middle of the night, there were dozens of them buzzing and crawling against the inside of the glass, landing on her face. I froze. I didn't even have time to process the horror before I turned around. The man wasn't looking for jumper cables anymore. He was just standing right behind me, holding a heavy tire iron he must have had tucked into his waistband. He wasn't lunging at me. He was just standing there, looking at me with an expression of profound, quiet sadness. It was the look of a man who had completely lost his mind but was still trying to be polite. "She needs a friend," he whispered. His voice was calm, which made it 10 times worse. "She's been so lonely since the accident. She just needs someone to sit with her." Then he started to raise the tire iron. I didn't think. I just reacted. I had my heavy Maglite flashlight in my hand, and I swung it as hard as I could at his face. I felt it connect with his jaw, and he let out a muffled groan. I didn't wait to see if he fell. I turned and bolted. I didn't go for my truck. He was between me and the parking lot. Instead, I ran straight into the tall cornfields that bordered the rest stop. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire. Then I collapsed into the dirt between the stalks. I stayed there for 4 hours, perfectly still. I could hear him. For the first hour, he was walking the perimeter of the field, calling out for me. At first, he sounded angry, screaming profanities. Then his voice shifted. He started pleading, crying, telling me that I was being selfish and that Sarah just wanted to talk. Eventually, the woods went silent. When the sun finally started to come up, I crawled to the edge of the field. The white sedan was gone. My truck was still sitting there, the driver's side door still wide open. I ran to it, hopped in, and drove until I found a state trooper about 20 miles down the road. I told him everything. The police found the girl's body 2 days later. She was dumped in a drainage ditch about 50 miles away. She'd been reported missing 3 weeks prior from a town in Colorado. She hadn't died in an accident. They never caught the man. They found my DNA on his car and his blood on the pavement where I hid him. But he was a ghost. He didn't exist in any database. Now, I don't drive at night anymore. If I'm on a road trip and it starts to get dark, I find a well-lit hotel in a busy city. I won't even pull over for gas if the station looks too quiet, because every time I close my eyes, I see those flies on the glass and that look of sadness in his eyes, knowing that he's still out there, looking for someone else to keep his daughter company. This happened back in the fall of 2018. Me and two of my closest friends, Mark and Sarah, decided to do a 4-day trek through a remote part of the Shenandoah Valley. We weren't rookies. We had all the right gear, high-end GPS units, and we'd done plenty of backcountry trips before. It was supposed to be a standard getaway to clear our heads before the winter started. The first day was completely normal. We hiked about 8 miles, set up camp, ate some dehydrated meals, and turned in early. The weather was perfect, crisp, cool mountain air, and a clear sky. There wasn't a single soul around us for miles, which is exactly what we wanted. We spent most of the time talking about work and planning our next big trip, so it felt safe. On the morning of day 2, things started to feel a little bit different. We were about 3 miles into the day's hike when Mark stopped and pointed at the middle of the trail. There was a small pile of stones, stacked perfectly into a pyramid. We figured it was just a trail marker left by another hiker, even though we were on a pretty overgrown path. But then, a half-mile later, we saw another one, and another. This was unusual. Then we started seeing the dolls. They were tiny, maybe 4 inches long, made out of dried grass and tied together with what looked like dirty fishing line. They were hanging from low branches right at eye level. We joked about it, but the atmosphere had definitely shifted. The woods felt quieter. Around 4 p.m., we hit a section of the forest where the air felt heavy. That's when the smell started. It wasn't the smell of a dead animal, which is usually sour. This was metallic and sweet. It was so strong it made the back of my throat itch. We pushed through that area quickly, trying to reach the creek where we planned to camp for the night. We set up our tents near the water just as the sun was going down. We were all exhausted, so we didn't stay up late. Mark and Sarah shared one tent, and I had my own small one-man setup about 10 feet away. I remember falling asleep to the sound of the creek, feeling relatively tucked away and hidden by the brush. I woke up at exactly 12:14 a.m. I know the time because I checked my watch immediately. The woods were dead silent, except for a sound that made my skin crawl. It was someone whistling. It wasn't a song or a melody. It was just a low, tuneless warble that went up and down in pitch. It sounded like it was coming from right next to the dead embers of our campfire. I stayed perfectly still, my heart thumping against my ribs. I slowly unzipped the mesh of my tent just an inch so I could peek out. The moon was bright enough that I could see everything. There was a man sitting on a log by our fire. He was naked from the waist up, and even though it was nearly freezing, he wasn't shivering. He was methodically going through our backpacks. He wasn't looking for our wallets or our expensive GPS units. He was just pulling out mundane things. He took a pair of Mark's socks and put them in his pocket. Then he grabbed Sarah's toothbrush and ran his thumb over the bristles. But the most disturbing part was what he held in his left hand. It was a series of small, blonde clumps of hair. Sarah is a blonde. He must have gone in their tent while they were dead asleep and cut it. I reached for my bear spray, trying to be as silent as possible. But the moment the nylon on my sleeping bag rustled, the whistling stopped. The man didn't jump or run. He slowly turned his head and looked directly in my tent. His eyes were wide and completely vacant, reflecting the moonlight like an animal's would. He didn't say a word. He picked up Sarah's hairbrush from the pile of things he'd taken out, and right as he made eye contact with me through the mesh, he took a long, slow lick of the bristles. He stood up with a weird, jerky motion, and walked into the tree. He didn't make a sound as he moved. No branches snapping, no leaves crunching. He just disappeared. I didn't scream. I quickly scrambled out of my tent and hissed for Mark and Sarah to wake up. I told them we had to leave right now. They were confused and groggy until they saw the state of our gear and the missing patches of hair near Sarah's temple. The look of pure terror on her face is something I'll never forget. We didn't even pack the tents. We just grabbed our boots and ran. The hike back was a nightmare. We used our headlamps, but the light only made the shadows look deeper. Every time a twig snapped or the wind blew through the pines, we thought he was right behind us. We felt eyes on the back of our necks the entire 5 miles back to the trailhead. It felt like he was escorting us out, making sure we didn't stop. We reached the ranger station just as the sun was coming up. We were scratched up, freezing, and shaking. When we explained what happened, the ranger's face went completely pale. He didn't seem surprised. He told us there had been reports of a man living off-grid in that sector for years. He was a local who had lost his family in a house fire and had just gone into the woods and never came back. The police went up there a few days later, but they found nothing. Our tents were gone. The stone piles were gone. It was like we had never been there at all. We tried to get back to our normal lives, but the feeling of being violated stayed with us. Sarah, especially, struggled with the idea that he had been inches away from her face while she slept. A week after we got home, Sarah called me. She was hyperventilating. She had been cleaning out her hiking jacket, a heavy coat she hadn't worn since the trip because it had been too warm. She found a small, hand-sewn pouch tucked into a hidden inner pocket near the hem. It was a pocket she never used. She hadn't even known it was there. Inside the pouch was a collection of dried, yellowed fingernails, and at the bottom, there was a scrap of dirty paper. On it, written in shaky, cramped handwriting, was her current home address in Richmond. We have no idea how he got it. We checked her ID and her wallet, and nothing was missing. He must have just looked at her driver's license and memorized it before putting it back. We did everything we are supposed to do. We changed the locks, installed a high-end security system, and Sarah eventually moved to a different apartment across town. But it didn't help. A few months ago, she stopped staying at her place alone. She says that when the wind dies down at night, she can hear that low, tuneless whistling coming from the alleyway behind her building. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't even like going into my own backyard after the sun goes down. People like to say that the woods are peaceful, but they aren't. There are things out there that watch you, things that follow you home, and things that keep pieces of you long after you've left the trail. I live every day knowing that somewhere, in a dark room or a hole in the dirt, a man is holding a clump of my friend's hair and waiting for the right time to use that address.